Calvin Reeves was 41 years old, and for 9 years he made his wife's coffee before she woke up. He was a union electrician, work boots by the door, calluses on his hands, and Diana was a real estate agent who had stopped hiding her embarrassment about that. She called him comfortable to the man she'd been meeting in hotels for 14 months. She told that man she had a plan. What Diana never considered was that the quiet man she'd written off had spent 7 years building something she knew nothing about. 11 rental properties, 2 commercial buildings, a portfolio worth $2.3 million, constructed in total silence while she looked right through him. On a Sunday afternoon, she told Calvin he wasn't ambitious enough, that she'd outgrown him, that she deserved more, and put him out of the house he paid for. He packed 2 bags and stood on the front steps without a single word. Then a silver Rolls-Royce Ghost turned into the driveway. What happened next would cost Diana everything she thought she'd already won. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light hadn't yet touched the Atlanta sky when Calvin Reeves pulled himself out of bed. The alarm clock's red numbers showed 5:45 a.m., same as every workday for the past 9 years. He moved quietly through the darkness, his feet finding the familiar path to the kitchen of the craftsman home he'd bought when they first married. Calvin sat at the kitchen table and pulled on his work boots, the leather worn but well-maintained. He'd bought them 2 years ago from the same shop he always used, the one run by old Mr. Johnson, who remembered everyone's size. The laces made soft whispers against the eyelets as he threaded them with practiced hands. The coffee maker hummed to life under his touch. He measured the grounds carefully. 2 scoops plus a quarter more, just how Diana liked it. The ritual was as natural as breathing. Set the timer for 7:30 when she'd wake up. Rinse his travel mug. Check the cream level in the fridge. 9 years of mornings, and he'd never once forgotten. The kitchen showed signs of his handiwork everywhere, though most people wouldn't notice. He'd fixed the uneven tile near the sink himself, installed the under-cabinet lighting Diana had wanted, upgraded the electrical panel to handle the new appliances. The house had good bones, but Calvin had made it better, piece by piece, the way he did everything, quietly, thoroughly, without needing praise. His crew would be waiting at the union job site by 7. They were working on a big commercial building downtown, rewiring 3 floors of offices. Calvin ran his team with the same attention to detail he brought to everything else. No shortcuts, no mistakes. His reputation in Atlanta's electrical trade was solid gold, built on years of showing up early and doing things right the first time. A few rentals on the side, he'd tell Diana when she occasionally asked about his Saturday morning disappearances. She'd nod, already thinking about something else, her mind on her real estate showings or her next open house. The properties were just background noise to her, like the hum of the refrigerator he'd installed last spring. The sun was starting to rise when Calvin remembered he needed to move some equipment for a side job. His truck was in the shop for routine maintenance, so he'd have to use Diana's car. She wouldn't mind. She had showings all afternoon anyway. He found her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, another piece of their shared life. The early morning air was cool as he walked to her white Lexus, parked in its usual spot in the driveway. The car chirped softly as he unlocked it. That's when he saw it. A hotel key card lying face down on the passenger side floor mat. The blue and white logo was visible even in the dim light. Calvin looked at it for a long moment, his hand still on the door handle. The morning birds were starting their chorus, but everything else seemed very quiet. With steady fingers, he picked up the key card. Marriott, downtown Atlanta. He turned it over once, then tucked it in his pocket. The equipment could wait another day. Back in the kitchen, Calvin placed the key card precisely in the center of the granite counter island, where Diana would see it when she came down for her coffee. He washed his travel mug, filled it, and headed to work. That evening, He watched Diana move around the kitchen, preparing dinner. The key card sat untouched where he'd left it, like a small white ghost on the dark granite. She worked around it, reaching past it for spices, setting down cutting boards near it, never acknowledging its existence. Her movements were too careful to be natural. They ate dinner together as usual. Diana talked about her day, about a difficult client, about plans for the weekend. Calvin listened, responded in all the right places, but part of him was watching her hands, watching how they never strayed near that corner of the counter. After dinner, Diana loaded the dishwasher while Calvin wiped down the counters. When he reached the keycard, he paused. Diana's back was to him, but he saw her shoulders tense slightly. He picked up the card, wiped under it, and set it back down in exactly the same spot. Later, as they got ready for bed, Calvin noticed how Diana avoided his eyes in the bathroom mirror. She was humming something under her breath, a habit she had when she was nervous, but trying not to show it. He brushed his teeth, watching their reflection. Husband and wife. 9 years of mornings and evenings, of shared spaces and separate secrets. Diana fell asleep quickly, her breathing evening out into familiar rhythms. Calvin lay awake beside her, looking at the ceiling he'd repainted last summer. Everything in the room was quiet except for the soft tick of the bedside clock, counting out seconds between what was and what would be. The Friday evening air was thick with early summer heat when Calvin pulled his work truck into the driveway. It was almost 9, and the street was lined with unfamiliar cars. Diana's dinner party for her real estate colleagues was in full swing. He'd stayed late at the job site deliberately, checking and double-checking the new circuit installations until even his most thorough habits couldn't justify staying longer. Music and laughter spilled out of the open windows of their craftsman home. Calvin sat in his truck for a moment, watching shadows move across the curtains. He could see Diana's silhouette, wine glass in hand, moving from group to group with the easy grace she always showed at these gatherings. He grabbed his tool belt from the passenger seat and headed for the side door that led straight to the kitchen. His work boots were heavy on the steps, boots that had carried him up and down ladders all day, through crawl spaces and across construction sites. They were part of who he was, these boots, like the calluses on his hands and the careful way he thought through problems. The kitchen was empty when he entered, but voices carried from the living room. He set his tool belt on its hook by the door and unlaced his boots, setting them neatly beside the row of shining dress shoes and high heels that lined the entryway. "Calvin!" Diana's voice was bright, pitched just a little higher than normal. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the blue dress he'd given her for Christmas. "I didn't think you'd make it." "Job ran late," he said simply, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. "Come join us. Everyone's having such a wonderful time." He followed her into the living room, where 8 or 9 people stood in clusters, holding wine glasses and small plates. The coffee table was spread with the kind of fancy appetizers Diana ordered from that place downtown. Nothing like the simple meals they used to share when they first married. "Look who finally made it," Diana announced, her hand light on his arm. The conversation dipped for a moment, then resumed as if he hadn't entered. Calvin recognized most of them from previous gatherings. Mark from Diana's office, Sarah and her husband from the mortgage company, a few others whose names blurred together. They all had that same polished look. Expensive watches, designer clothes, carefully casual postures that spoke of membership in a club Calvin had never wanted to join. "There's food in the kitchen," Diana said, already drifting away toward another conversation. He stood there for a moment, watching how easily they all moved in this world they shared with his wife. Someone was talking about a new development in Buckhead. Someone else mentioned country club memberships. Their words flowed around him like water around a stone. "Those work boots by the door yours, Calvin?" It was Mark, smirking slightly over his wine glass. "Must have been quite a day on the tools." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest group. Diana's laugh came quickest, loudest, like she needed to prove she was in on the joke. "Every day's a day on the tools," Calvin said quietly. He didn't explain that those tools had built everything they were standing on. Didn't mention the properties those tools had helped him renovate. Some truths weren't meant for people who wouldn't understand them anyway. The party continued around him. He made a plate of food he didn't really want, answered questions no one really cared about, watched Diana perform her role as hostess with practiced ease. It was nearly midnight when the last guest left. Diana disappeared upstairs while Calvin gathered empty glasses from various surfaces. He was loading the dishwasher when he went to the bathroom off the kitchen and saw her phone lying on the counter, screen still lit from whatever last message she'd been sending. Something made him pause, that same diagnostic instinct that had served him well for 20 years of electrical work. When something feels wrong, you trace the current back to its source. The phone's screen showed a message thread with someone named Philip G. Calvin had never heard Diana mention a Philip, but as he scrolled up, 14 months of messages filled the screen. Hotel meetings at the downtown Marriott, weekend trips Diana had called conferences, intimate conversations about their future together. And there, scattered through the messages like bitter seeds, were Diana's words about Calvin himself. "He's comfortable. Just managing the situation for now. I have a plan. Be patient." With steady hands, Calvin opened his own phone's camera. He photographed screen after screen of messages, making sure each one was clear and readable. When he was done, he closed her phone exactly as he'd found it and walked to the kitchen. The house was quiet now. All the party sounds faded to memory. Calvin filled a glass with water from the tap, the same tap he'd fixed last month when it started dripping. He drank slowly, looking out the window at the darkness beyond. Upstairs, he could hear Diana getting ready for bed, humming that nervous tune again. He finished his water, rinsed the glass, and set it in the drain board. He would not wake her tonight. Would not confront what he'd seen. Calvin Reeves had learned long ago that understanding came before action, and he needed to understand everything before he made his next move. 3 days felt like 3 years. Calvin moved through them like a man underwater, every gesture slowed and deliberate. He made Diana's coffee each morning, just as he always had. He came home at his usual time. He answered her distracted questions about his day with the same quiet patience he'd shown for 9 years. But he noticed everything now, how she angled away from him when they passed in the hallway, how her phone never left her hand, how she'd started taking calls in the backyard, where the neighbors' air conditioning units would mask her voice. Each detail clicked into place like wires in a junction box, completing a circuit he wished he'd never had to trace. Sunday afternoon arrived heavy with humidity, the kind of Georgia heat that made the air feel solid. Calvin sat at the kitchen table, reading the paper and drinking coffee, when Diana appeared in the doorway. She wore the expression he'd seen forming behind her eyes for days, determined, rehearsed, almost righteous. "We need to talk," she said, pulling out the chair across from him. Her voice had that practiced tone she used with difficult clients. Calvin folded his paper carefully, aligning the edges with methodical precision. "All right, this isn't working anymore." Diana's hands were flat on the table, manicured nails pressing into the wood. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air between them. Calvin watched a bead of condensation roll down his coffee cup, leaving a dark ring on the table's surface. "I need you to leave today," she continued, gaining momentum. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. This house is mostly in my name anyway. And let's be honest, you can't afford to buy me out." Calvin sat very still, watching her remake herself into the woman she wanted to be. Someone too good for a man who wore work boots and carried tools. "You're not ambitious enough," she said, each word sharp and practiced. "You're content just being an electrician, managing a few rentals on the side. Do you know how embarrassing it is when my colleagues ask what my husband does?" Everyone else's husband is a executive or owns their own company. But you, she gestured at his coffee cup, the simple button-down shirt he wore. You're comfortable being ordinary. The word landed like a key turning in a lock. Comfortable. The same word she'd used in those messages to Philip. I've outgrown this, Diana pressed on. I deserve more. I need someone who understands my world, who can give me the life I should have. I need you gone by tonight. Calvin stood slowly, his chair scraping against the tile floor. I'll pack a bag. That's it? Diana's composure cracked slightly. You're not going to fight for this? He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing clearly the woman who'd spent 14 months plotting his disposal. No. Upstairs, Calvin packed efficiently. 2 duffel bags with clothes, toiletries, his father's watch, the photograph of his parents he kept on his dresser. He could hear Diana pacing downstairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a metronome counting down the minutes. When he came down, she stood by the front door with her arms crossed, watching him as if she expected him to break, to beg, to reveal himself as desperate as she needed him to be. Instead, he stepped out onto the front porch and set his bags down carefully. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their manicured lawn. Behind him, Diana leaned against the doorframe, already starting to wear the expression of someone who'd made a difficult but necessary choice. That's when they heard it. The whisper-quiet purr of a luxury engine. A silver Rolls-Royce Ghost, gleaming like mercury in the sunlight, turned into their driveway with elegant precision. The driver, a young man in a tailored dark jacket, emerged smoothly and approached the steps. Without a word, he collected Calvin's bags and placed them in the trunk with practiced care. Calvin felt Diana's stillness behind him, felt the sudden tension radiating from her rigid posture. He turned, meeting her wide eyes for just a moment. Questions crowded behind her stare, but he had no answers to give her anymore. The ghost's door opened with that signature soft, close smoothness. Calvin descended the steps and slid into the leather interior without looking back again. The door closed with a gentle click that seemed to echo across the quiet street. As the car pulled away, he caught a final glimpse in the side mirror. Diana stood frozen on the porch of the house she thought was hers, her crossed arms now looking less like confidence and more like she was holding herself together. For the first time since she'd married him, she was asking herself the question she should have asked years ago. Who is my husband? The Rolls-Royce Ghost glided through Atlanta's streets as evening settled over the city. Calvin sat in the back, watching familiar neighborhoods slide past through tinted windows. The driver, James, a veteran's son Calvin had hired 6 months ago, navigated with quiet efficiency toward Buckhead. They pulled up to a red-brick 3-bedroom on a tree-lined street. The property stood apart from its neighbors with subtle details. New gutters, fresh landscaping, restored original windows that had cost Calvin 3 weekends to repair himself. He'd bought it last year, renovated it personally on weekends. Diana thought he was doing maintenance checks and kept it rented at market rate until 3 weeks ago. The moment he'd found that hotel key card, he'd quietly arranged for the current tenants to relocate early with 2 months free rent at another of his properties. Some would call it paranoia. Calvin called it preparation. "We're here, Mr. Reeves," James said, opening the car door. Calvin stepped out, taking in the house he now lived in. The porch light clicked on automatically, another upgrade he'd installed himself. James carried the bags inside while Calvin punched in the security code and disabled the alarm. The interior was move-in ready. Furnished, utilities connected, kitchen stocked. Calvin had arranged everything through his property management team, people who knew how to be discreet because he paid them well to be. The furniture was simple but solid. No particle board, no cheap veneer. Real wood, real leather, pieces that would last. He'd learned that from his father. Buy quality once instead of replacement twice. Morning came too quickly. and not quickly enough. Calvin showered, dressed in a charcoal suit he kept at the house for property closings, and drove his truck, not the Ghost, to Troy Okafor's law office downtown. The familiar weight of his work boots felt grounding. He hadn't slept much, but his mind was clear. Troy's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower near Peachtree Street. The receptionist recognized Calvin immediately. He'd been coming here for 7 years, since the day he'd walked in with an inheritance check and a business plan written in a composition notebook. "He's waiting for you," she said, buzzing him through. Troy stood as Calvin entered, coming around his desk to grip his friend's shoulder. They'd known each other 16 years, since Calvin first arrived in Atlanta with that truck and tool belt. Troy had been a junior associate then. Now his name was on the door. "Sit down," Troy said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "Tell me everything." Calvin did. The hotel keycard, the phone messages, Diana's performance the night before. He laid it out like a wiring diagram. Clean, sequential, no emotion clouding the facts. Troy listened, taking notes in his precise handwriting. When Calvin finished, Troy opened a thick folder on his desk. "Let me show you exactly what we're protecting," Troy said, spreading documents across the polished surface. "Reeves Capital Holdings, LLC, formed 7 years ago. Current holdings, 11 residential rental properties, fully occupied, all maintained above code. 2 commercial properties, both with long-term tenants and triple net leases." He laid out photographs of each property alongside their financial statements. Total portfolio value as of last month's assessment, $2.3 million. Monthly passive income after expenses, mortgage payments, and maintenance reserves, $14,700. Calvin looked at the empire he'd built in silence, piece by quiet piece. The apartment complex on Memorial? The 12-unit? Troy nodded. Closing was scheduled for next month. Would have pushed monthly income to just over $19,000. "That was supposed to be our anniversary gift," Calvin said quietly. "I was going to bring her into the LLC. Show her everything we'd built." Troy's jaw tightened. "She has no claim to any of it. The LLC predates the marriage. You funded it with inheritance money and premarital savings. We documented everything when we set it up. The properties, the Ghost, the management company. It's all protected." Calvin nodded, studying the photographs. Each property represented countless Saturday mornings, evenings after work, careful calculations at his kitchen table, while Diana watched reality TV in the next room. "I need everything separated," Calvin said. "Everything documented. And I need to understand exactly what she can legally touch." Troy was already pulling out more papers. The marital home, joint accounts. That's it. But Calvin, he leaned forward. "What do you want to do?" Calvin stood, straightening his suit jacket. His voice was steady, controlled. "First, I need to know everything. The full picture. Why she did this, what she planned, who else was involved. I don't throw a punch until I know where I'm standing." "And then?" Troy asked. "Then we protect what's ours. But right now, I need a different kind of professional." The morning after meeting Troy, Calvin sat in his truck outside a small office building on the edge of downtown. The sign read, "Matthews Investigative Services," in plain black letters. No flash, no promises of dramatic revelations, just professional competence. Troy had recommended David Matthews specifically because he was methodical and discreet. Calvin checked his watch. 8:55 a.m. He never showed up late, and he never showed up early. At exactly 9 u, he walked through the door. David Matthews looked exactly like what he was. A former police detective who'd found more satisfaction in private work. Gray hair, practical suit, eyes that noticed everything without revealing they noticed. "Mr. Reeves," Matthews said, rising from behind his desk. "Please sit." Calvin took the offered chair and placed a manila envelope on the desk. "Everything I have so far. Text messages, dates, the hotel keycard. But that's not why I'm here. Matthews raised an eyebrow. Tell me what you need. There's a word in those messages that keeps coming back to me. Comfortable. She called me comfortable while telling another man to be patient, that she had a plan. Calvin leaned forward. I need to know what that plan was. The full scope of it. Matthews opened the envelope, scanning the contents. Timeline? 2 weeks. I'll pay whatever it costs. I'll start today. Exactly 14 days later, Calvin sat at his kitchen table, a fresh manila envelope in front of him. The investigator's report was methodical, detailed, and devastating. Diana had discovered Reeves Capital Holdings LLC 8 months ago. Not by accident. Not through casual curiosity. Through a deliberate property record search. The kind she ran daily as a real estate agent, checking comparable sales and ownership histories. The report included screenshots of database queries with timestamps. Diana had spent 3 hours that first night digging through every property connected to the LLC. She'd pulled tax records, permit applications, rental license. She knew the portfolio's scope. She knew its value. Calvin read further, his coffee growing cold beside him. The plan referenced in those messages unfolded with brutal clarity. Diana had intended to file for divorce before he acquired more properties. Specifically, before the 12-unit apartment complex she'd discovered was under negotiation. She would argue the LLC was built using marital funds, a legal claim Troy had called weak but possible. The expected settlement would then qualify her for a new home, with Philip Gaines already positioned as her mortgage broker. The timing hadn't been emotional, it had been strategic. She wasn't leaving a poor man. She was racing to leave before a quiet man got richer. The doorbell rang. Calvin looked up, remembering he'd asked Aunt Loretta to come over. He needed someone else to see this, someone who'd known Diana even longer than he had. Loretta swept in like a force of nature, all 5'4" of her radiating concern. She'd helped raise Calvin after his mother died, and she'd never lost that protective instinct. Baby, you look tired, she said, settling into the chair across from him. When's the last time you ate something proper? I'm fine, Aunt Loretta. He pushed the report across the table. I need you to read this. Loretta put on her reading glasses and began going through the pages. Her expression shifted from concern to something harder, darker. When she finished, she took off her glasses slowly. 8 months, she said. She knew for 8 months and kept playing house, kept taking your morning coffee, kept letting you think everything was fine while she planned how to gut you. Loretta reached across the table and put her hand over Calvin's. She looked at everything you built and saw something to take. Calvin folded the report carefully, precisely, squaring the corners. His voice was quiet, but certain. Not anymore. Diana sat in her attorney's office, signing the divorce petition with confident strokes. The LLC would be listed as a marital asset. Her attorney had assured her they had grounds to argue it was built during the marriage using joint resources. She hadn't mentioned how she'd discovered it, or when. Some details were better left unstated. We'll file this today, her attorney said, gathering the papers. Given the asset values involved, we should expect some pushback. Diana smiled, perfectly composed. Calvin isn't the pushback type. He never has been. Back in her car, she checked her phone. 3 missed calls from Philip. She'd moved into his Buckhead apartment 4 days ago. Temporary, she'd insisted, just until things settled. Already the arrangement felt different than she'd imagined. That morning, she'd found him studying her coffee cup with visible irritation. This isn't the brand I buy, he'd said. I have a system for everything in my kitchen. It was such a small thing, but it had stayed with her all day. Calvin had never once commented on her coffee choices. He'd simply learned how she took it and made it that way every morning for 9 years. She pulled into Philip's assigned parking spot. He'd been very specific about that too, and noticed his BMW was already there. He usually worked later. As she walked toward the building's entrance, she really looked at that car for the first time. 3 years old, base model, dealer plate frame still on. Nothing like the vehicle he'd described when they'd first met. Philip was waiting inside, pacing the living room. "Where have you been?" "I've been calling, filing the divorce papers," Diana said, setting down her purse. "You knew that's where I was going. You could have texted." He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair. "I had ideas about the settlement approach. We should discuss everything before any moves are made. This affects both our futures." Diana studied him, really seeing him for the first time in weeks. His suit was designer but from 3 seasons ago. The watch he wore so prominently was the only luxury item she'd seen him rotate. Even his apartment, which had impressed her initially, now revealed its shortcuts. Builder-grade fixtures he'd called transitional. Laminate flooring he'd described as European. "The approach is set," she said. "My attorney feels confident about the LLC claim." "But did you consider—" Philip started. "I've handled it," Diana cut in, her tone sharper than intended. She didn't need him managing this too. Philip's face tightened. "I've been in real estate finance for 15 years. I know how to structure these situations. The mortgage we discussed depends on getting this right." There it was, his real concern. The mortgage, their future home, the life he'd promised that was starting to feel less certain by the day. Diana's phone lit up with a text from her attorney. Petition filed, initial hearing date requested. It was time for the next step. One she'd planned carefully. "I need to make a call," she said, walking to the bedroom and closing the door before Philip could respond. She sat on the edge of the bed, took a deep breath, and dialed Calvin's number. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Diana?" His voice was exactly as she remembered. Quiet, steady. She felt a sudden surge of confidence. This was Calvin. She knew how to handle Calvin. "Hi," she said, keeping her tone warm but professional. "I thought we should talk directly, like adults." Silence on his end. She continued, each word carefully chosen. "I've filed the divorce petition. I'm sure you'll be receiving it soon. But I'm hoping we can handle this reasonably, without dragging things through the courts." More silence, but she knew he was listening. Calvin always listened. "I'm proposing mediation," she continued. "We split everything 50-50. Including the LLC. Clean break, minimal legal fees, no messy court battles. I think that's fair to both of us." She waited, expecting his usual pattern. Consideration, then acceptance. Calvin had always chosen peace over conflict. When he finally spoke, his voice was still quiet, still steady. "I'll have my attorney reach out." The line went dead before she could respond. Diana stared at her phone, an unfamiliar sensation creeping up her spine. Something in his tone had been different. Not angry, not hurt. Just different. Like she'd been talking to someone she didn't actually know. Outside the bedroom, she could hear Philip on a work call, his voice carrying that forced confidence she was starting to recognize. She thought about Calvin's simple response, about the Rolls-Royce that had appeared the day she'd thrown him out, about all the things she'd never bothered to ask about those few rentals he managed. Meanwhile, Calvin stood in his Buckhead kitchen, phone still in hand. He dialed Troy's number. "She just showed me her hand," he said when Troy answered. Troy's office was silent except for the steady clicking of his keyboard. Stacks of financial documents covered his desk. 3 years of credit card statements, bank records, loan applications. He'd been methodically building the divorce counter-filing for days, examining every transaction with the precision that had made him one of Atlanta's most respected business attorneys. He paused, frowning at his screen. "Calvin," he called out to his friend who sat in the corner reviewing property documents. "Come look at this." Calvin moved to stand behind Troy's chair. On the monitor was a spreadsheet tracking their joint credit card activity since 2020. "See these charges?" Troy pointed to a highlighted column. "Hotel bookings labeled as professional development. Restaurant charges filed under client meetings. Weekend trips categorized as real estate conferences, all on your joint card. Calvin leaned closer, his expression unchanging. How much? Over the past 3 years? Troy scrolled through the data. $38,000. All of it carefully categorized to look like legitimate business expenses. She knew you never questioned her professional charges. Calvin straightened, his hands clasped behind his back. She used our money to fund her affair. Yes, Troy confirmed. But that's not all. He pulled up another document. I found something while checking her loan applications. 2 years ago, she took out a personal loan. $12,000. I never saw that on any statements. Because it wasn't a bank loan, Troy said quietly. It was from your Aunt Loretta. Calvin's steady composure flickered for the first time. What? Troy handed him a printed check copy. Diana told Loretta it was for emergency home repairs. Something about foundation issues you didn't know about because, in her words, he worries too much. Loretta wrote her the check from her personal savings account. Calvin stared at the check copy, at his aunt's familiar signature. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. She never mentioned it to you, Troy continued. Never repaid it. Loretta's bank statements show no deposits from Diana since. Calvin set the paper down carefully, precisely. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but carried a new weight. She took advantage of my aunt's love for me. Yes. Troy leaned back in his chair. Calvin, this changes things. The credit card fraud alone is significant, but exploiting family relationship for financial gain? That's different. Print everything, Calvin said. I need to see my aunt. An hour later, Calvin pulled up to Loretta's small ranch house in southwest Atlanta. The porch light was on. She always kept it on for him. He sat in his car for a moment, gathering himself. Loretta opened the door before he reached the steps. One look at his face, and she knew something was wrong. Come in, baby. I'll put on some coffee. In her warm kitchen, surrounded by the familiar scent of cinnamon and decades of family meals, Calvin showed her the documents. He explained everything. The affair, the divorce, the financial deceptions. Finally, he showed her the check copy. I didn't know, he said softly. I never knew she came to you for money. Loretta sat very still, her coffee untouched. She said it was urgent. Said you'd been working so hard. She didn't want to worry you with house problems. She shook her head slowly. I believed her because she was your wife. Because I thought she loved you like I love you. I'll pay you back, Calvin started. With interest? Hush now, Loretta cut him off. This isn't about the money. This is about trust. About family. She reached across the table and took his hand. She didn't just steal from me. She used my love for you as a tool. Used it to take advantage. Calvin squeezed her hand gently. The anger he'd been controlling so carefully shifted into something deeper, something with real heat. Loretta studied his face for a long moment. Then she straightened in her chair, her voice taking on the steel that had guided him since childhood. Baby, you go get everything back. Calvin nodded once. He understood what she meant. Not just the money, but everything. The dignity, the truth, the consequences that had been delayed too long. The counterfiling would be comprehensive. It would document every deception, every dollar, every calculated choice. Diana had built her plan on the assumption that Calvin was exactly what she'd told Philip. Comfortable, passive, simple. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. The law firm's conference room gleamed with polished wood and morning light. Troy had chosen this particular room deliberately. 14th floor, corner views of downtown Atlanta, the kind of space that projected quiet authority. He and Calvin arrived 15 minutes early to arrange the documents in precise order. Calvin adjusted his tie, a deep blue against a crisp white shirt. He wasn't dressed to impress. He was dressed like a man who had always known his worth, even when others missed it. You're sure about this? Troy asked, setting out water glasses. "We could let the filing speak for itself." "I want her to hear it from me," Calvin said. "Once, in person." At exactly 10 o'clock, Diana arrived with her attorney, Richard Bennett, a silver-haired man whose confident stride faltered slightly when he saw Troy. The two lawyers had faced each other before. Only one of them had won. Diana wore a cream-colored blazer and projecting composed professionalism. She'd prepared for this meeting, Calvin could tell. Rehearsed her expressions, planned her responses. She sat down across from him with the same measured smile she'd used when calling to propose mediation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she started, her voice warm and reasonable. "I think if we talk directly—" "I'm not here to negotiate," Calvin interrupted quietly. He opened the folder in front of him. "I'm here to make sure you understand exactly what's about to happen." Diana's smile flickered but held. Bennett shifted in his chair. "First," Calvin said, sliding a document across the table, "the timeline of your relationship with Philip Gaines. 14 months of hotel receipts, dinner charges, weekend trips, all documented with dates, locations, and amounts. You used our joint credit card, Diana. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" "Those were business expenses," Diana started. Calvin laid down another document. "Your text messages with Philip discussing which hotels to book, which restaurants had private rooms, how to categorize the charges so I wouldn't notice." He looked at her directly. $38,000 of fraud, Diana. Not business, fraud." Diana's smile vanished. Bennett leaned forward to examine the documents. "Next," Calvin continued, his voice steady, "your discovery of my LLC through property records 8 months ago. Here's the search history from your work computer. The same day you found it, you messaged Philip about finally having leverage. You started planning the divorce that afternoon." Color drained from Diana's face. She hadn't known about the computer records. "You spent 8 months, Calvin said, laying down more papers, strategizing how to claim a share of my business. Here's your messages discussing it. Here's Philip's mortgage pre-qualification letter, based on your projected settlement. Here's the real estate listings you sent him for houses you planned to buy with money you thought you could take from me." Diana's hands were trembling slightly. She clasped them together in her lap. "But what I really want to talk about," Calvin said, his voice taking on a new weight, "is this." He placed the check copy on the table. $12,000 you borrowed from my aunt. You told her it was for emergency repairs I didn't know about. You used my aunt's love for me to steal from her. I was going to pay her back," Diana whispered. "When?" Calvin asked simply. "It's been 2 years. You never mentioned it to me. Never made a single payment. You just took advantage of an older woman's trust and walked away." Bennett whispered something in Diana's ear. Her jaw tightened visibly. "Here's what's going to happen," Calvin said, gesturing to the documents spread across the table. "The judge will see all of this. Every message, every charge, every calculation you made thinking I was too simple to notice. The LLC is protected. It predates our marriage and was funded with inherited money. You have no claim to it. But you do have liability for $38,000 in fraudulent credit card charges and $12,000 stolen from my aunt." Diana sat very still, her carefully constructed image crumbling under the weight of evidence she couldn't deny. Calvin gathered his papers back into the folder with methodical precision. He stood, straightening his tie with the same careful attention he'd always given to every detail of his life. "You thought I was comfortable," he said, looking down at her. "I was patient. There's a difference." He turned and walked out. Troy followed, closing the door behind them with a soft click that felt like final punctuation. Through the glass wall, Calvin could see Diana staring at the empty table where the documents had been. Documents that told the true story of who she was and who she'd tried to destroy. She had no more moves left to make. The divorce decree landed on Calvin's desk with the weight of finality. Troy had delivered it personally, though Calvin barely needed to read it. Every detail unfolded exactly as they'd planned in that conference room 3 weeks earlier. The LLC claim was dismissed entirely, Troy confirmed, settling into the chair across from Calvin's desk. Judge didn't even hesitate. Your documentation was bulletproof. Calvin nodded, turning to the settlement page. The numbers told their own story. Diana's share of the marital home's equity came to less than $30,000. The refinance she'd taken out 2 years ago, the one she'd never mentioned, had eaten away most of the value she'd counted on. That's about a quarter of what she promised Philip, Troy observed, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Speaking of Philip, he pulled another document from his briefcase. The Georgia Department of Banking and Finance letterhead stood stark against the white paper. The complaint is filed. We documented everything. How he pre-qualified Diana for a mortgage while actively participating in marital fraud. How he used his professional license to facilitate a scheme he knew about from the beginning. Troy's precise language carried the force of coming consequences. His 2 biggest commercial lending partners already caught wind of the investigation. They pulled their backing yesterday. Calvin watched the Atlanta skyline through his office window, the morning sun catching glass and steel. His brokerage won't survive the month. He's already looking for salaried positions, mid-tier firms, entry-level roles, the kind where you report to someone younger than you and smile about it. Troy allowed himself a small smile. Turns out, reputation matters in mortgage lending. The phone on Calvin's desk lit up, his assistant announcing another call from Diana's number. 3rd one this week. He pressed ignore without breaking his rhythm. The real estate commission? Calvin asked. Troy nodded, producing another document. Filed the complaint this morning. Diana used her professional access to property records to identify and target assets for divorce strategy before any legal separation. That's a serious ethical violation. They've suspended her license pending review. Calvin absorbed this without visible reaction. How long? Minimum 6 months. Could be longer depending on the hearing. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of consequences settling into place like perfectly fitted gears. Beverly Whitfield called my office yesterday, Troy said carefully, watching Calvin's face. Diana's mother. She's seen all the documentation. Calvin's expression remained neutral. What did she want? To apologize. She asked if you'd take her call. No. Calvin's response was quiet, but final. That family has nothing left to say to me. Troy gathered his papers, sensing the conversation's natural end. But before he could stand, Calvin spoke again. What about Diana's new place? Small rental off Peachtree. All she could qualify for without income or Philip's backing. Her first check from the temp agency barely covered the deposit. Calvin nodded once, processing this last piece without satisfaction or regret. The Philip who'd seemed so confident in those text messages hadn't lasted a month once his financial facade cracked. He'd disappeared from Diana's life as quickly as he'd invaded it, leaving her with a suspended license and a stack of rental applications no one wanted to approve. The plan she'd executed with such precision, the careful manipulation, the strategic timing, the calculated cruelty, had collapsed under its own hollow weight. She had less now than when she'd started. No house, no license, no lover, no leverage. Through his window, Calvin could see a construction crane swinging slowly against the sky, building something new. He didn't need to watch Diana's life unravel. The consequences would unfold whether he watched them or not. I'll need you to review the paperwork on that 12-unit building, Calvin said, turning back to his desk. The inspection report came in clean. Troy nodded, understanding. There was nothing left to say about Diana, or Philip, or consequences. Calvin was already looking forward, the way he always had. I'll have it on your desk tomorrow morning, Troy said, standing to leave. The morning sun caught Calvin's window again, filling the office with clear light. Outside, Atlanta was waking up, moving forward, building new things on solid foundations. The autumn air carried a crisp promise as Calvin stood in the parking lot of the 12-unit apartment building, hands in his pockets, taking in the solid brick facade. 6 months had passed since the divorce finalized, but this moment wasn't about the past. This was about foundation and future. Troy approached from his car, manila envelope in hand. "Everything's ready. Just need your signature." Calvin nodded, accepting the pen Troy offered. He leaned against the hood of his car, scanning each page with the same careful attention he gave every contract. The morning sun caught the building's windows, 12 units of possibility stretching before him. "You know," Troy said quietly, "this was supposed to be an anniversary gift," Calvin finished, his voice steady. "Now, it's just mine." He signed the final page with the same precise strokes he used on electrical permits and work orders. No flourish, just purpose. Troy extended his hand. "Congratulations. Property number 14. Calvin shook it firmly, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another acquisition. This was the one he'd planned differently, imagined differently. But standing here now, he realized the building was exactly where it belonged. Later that afternoon, Calvin pulled into Aunt Loretta's driveway, a sealed envelope on his passenger seat. She opened her front door before he reached the porch, always knowing his footsteps. "You're early for Sunday dinner," she said, but her eyes were already reading his expression. "Got something for you." He handed her the envelope. Inside was a check for $12,000 and a note in his careful handwriting. "With interest. Thank you for believing in me before I could show you why." Loretta's hands trembled slightly. Tears welled in her eyes. "Now, don't start that," Calvin said softly. "You go buy something nice. Maybe that kitchen counter you've been talking about." "Calvin James Reeves," she managed, her voice wavering. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." He hugged her tight. "You were the only one who saw me clear from the beginning." Driving back to the office, Calvin's thoughts drifted to Adaize. They'd met 3 months ago through a mutual contractor connection. Her structural engineering firm had worked on several projects in the area. Their first conversation had stretched 2 hours over coffee, most of it about load calculations and foundation types. Last week, she'd asked to see one of his properties, not out of politeness or performance, but genuine professional curiosity. He'd shown her the newest acquisition, a small commercial space near downtown. "These support beams," she'd said, running her hand along the exposed steel. "Original to the building?" "Added in '92, Calvin had answered. Previous owner's records showed the retrofit. She'd nodded approvingly. "Smart choice. Maintains the historical facade while adding another 50 years of structural integrity." Watching her examine the building's bones with expert eyes, Calvin had felt something unlock in his chest. He'd caught himself smiling, not because he was trying to, but because it simply happened. Across town, Diana sat at a red light, staring at the familiar signage on a commercial building, Reeves Capital Holdings, LLC. She'd searched that name once, late at night, when her plan had felt perfect and airtight. Now, 3 months into her license suspension, working a temp job that barely covered rent, that memory felt like a story about someone else. The building stood solid and well-maintained, like everything Calvin touched. She remembered standing on the porch that Sunday, arms crossed, watching the Rolls-Royce pull away. His face in the window, unreadable then, but crystal clear now. She had thrown away a man she never bothered to look at clearly, too busy planning her escape to notice what she was leaving. The light turned green. Other cars honked. Diana drove on. That same morning, Calvin stepped out of the Rolls-Royce Ghost outside his favorite coffee shop in the old neighborhood. A former neighbor did a visible double-take through the window. Calvin nodded politely, ordered his usual dark roast, and took a seat by the window. The coffee was good. The morning was clear. He had no interest in being seen or making statements. He was simply living, the way he always had, quietly building something real, one careful piece at a time. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.